edition of Brown's Cafe. Today's guest is Gita Sehgal, and it won't be a lie if I say that I'm in awe of her. She is doing absolutely wonderful work related to humanitarian efforts. And instead of me talking now, I will let her do the talking because she's absolutely brilliant and we love her. So, here's Gita. Welcome, Gita, to Brown's Cafe.
I'm so happy to be here today.
Pleasure is all ours, Geeta. So, Geeta, I want to start right from the start. Would you tell us what are your some of the best memories of childhood, and where did you grow up?
I grew up in India, and people are a little surprised when I tell them sometimes how easy my childhood was, because they don't realize. I mean, stereotypes are there because for a reason, you know. I mean, the India is famous for having millions of disappeared women and girls, you know, because
Absolutely.
they either aborted because their sex is discovered in the womb, or they are neglected in childhood. Families who are poor will not give the money for their daughters, or and that of course is a failure of the state as well as the
Absolutely.
development of the family and so on. So so there is that aspect of life in India, but on the whole, I had a very happy childhood. There were some difficulties. My parents divorced. It was not a usual time. And they divorced in the 60s. There are many more people divorcing now, but at that time, it was quite rare and quite scandalous. And I mean, it's still a scandal in many families. But we managed to survive that. I mean, there's a long term thread of even in elite families, and I'm sure you know about this, that in many, many families, women do not inherit. So in my family, the men will make vast amounts of money in usually a corporate job or a senior public sector, like a civil service job or something like that. But all the family wealth accrues to the men. And so the men retire and tend to retire in my family, whereas the women go on working into their 90s, as my mother is still a working writer in her 90s.
Yeah.
But we lead fulfilling lives. And so I was never discouraged from doing anything. And what I think is very common that people don't realize is that a lot of parents do put a premium on education, even if they expect their daughters to get married, and that to be their a major goal. They still, even to get married, you have to have an education.
Yeah.
But that wasn't my parents' goal at all. They expected us to work and live fulfilled lives. So I
Absolutely.
had nobody ever taught me to cook. I mean, I have several gaps in my cooking skills. I had to teach myself because nobody
I'm
put me
sure
in.
that's very relatable.
I had to do it. I learned, I mean, I went abroad very young. I was still in my teens. I got a scholarship to a school abroad called Atlantic College, which is in Wales. It's a co ed sixth form school, quite a
Yes.
tough school in some ways, which I enjoyed, but was also quite traumatizing, having to swim in ice cold water and things like that. But I got through it, and I went to university in England as well, to the School of Oriental and African Studies. Um, but basically, that's what I was expected to do. I was expected to study and to do well, and marriage was fine, but that wasn't, an end goal as far as my mother was concerned, or my grandmother, or
Yeah.
anybody important to me. So I had an easy life, and I didn't see them as role models, but I suppose I took it for granted that women are there in public life because my grandmother was a very public woman. She was, in fact, an ambassador to Ireland and Britain, among things. She was a high commissioner to Britain and ambassador to Ireland in the late 50s, early 60s, but also the U.S. and the Soviet Union. She was after independence one of the first women ambassadors in the world, and then sent round to these major posts. But she was also there at the founding of the UN. So
Well,
what I think of as a role model part is not these great offices that she occupied, President of the UN General Assembly and so on, but um, her activism in the national movement when Indians fought for freedom, and she was jailed many times. She, when she came out of jail the last time, her husband died in jail. Well, he was actually let out just before he died, but he was dying by then, so he was let out to more or less to avoid an embarrassment for the British. And then she went to Bengal and worked in the Bengal famine and set up the first uh, chapter of an international organization dealing with children, and did work and organized Congress volunteers and the women in the Congress. Congress being the big party that led India to independence. Um, and she organized women in the Congress to work in this famine, which I'm reminded of a lot today, because today, again, we have a situation
Absolutely.
of horror, absolute horror in the country. But what's happening is that Indians of all kinds, very poor people, are stepping out and giving what little they have and sharing it. Rickshaw drivers, scooter drivers are taking sick people to hospitals. People are ordinary individuals are trying to source oxygen and trying to put them people in who don't have access to it in touch with it. In my town, there huge numbers of groups. Some of them are commercial, maybe they're restaurants. Some of them are ashrams, they're religious organizations. Some of them are just individuals who are cooking food for families that are COVID ill. My worry is that I see this on social media, and I don't know if the most destitute are getting access to
Absolutely.
to this. I mean, there are a lot of people who are struggling who are on social media, but then there are people who don't have access to social media. So we see now in this crisis people building their self reliance, but that has always been what my inspiration was. So it's not so much that they achieved great things in terms of high office and recognition, but that they did these things when it wasn't fashionable and when there was a moment of extreme crisis.
Absolutely. No. No, I agree. The stories and what we hear in the media, especially coming out of India, is absolutely heartbreaking as of now. It's a total chaos or mess, is what we see in social media. Well, we could be wrong or right. We don't really know, but we can only base it on what we see.
Right. I mean, the reports are absolutely accurate, and the reason they're accurate is because, and this, I mean, I'm not, I'm here, I'm in India, but I'm in a totally personal capacity, and I'm living, very quiet, shielded life with my mother, so I'm not, doing any big contribution. But young journalists, some of them working for papers that are very pro-government, but they have done their duty as reporters. They are doing every single day. This is in the foreign media because the Indian journalists are there, going to the crematorium every day, counting the dead, going into the countryside, finding those bodies of people buried by the Ganga, photographing the bodies that are floating in the Ganga, which is so tragic. It is
And
so sad and tragic and appalling. And they are doing that work. So when the foreign media reports it, it's because the Indian journalists have done all the work, the real
yeah,
work, the stories. The foreign media is reporting the stories, but they couldn't. They're not the one standing at the
yeah,
crematorium.
absolutely, yeah,
The job of the reporters that has been really crucial. And I feel it because I've been a journalist, I've broken stories in my time. I haven't worked on a daily paper like that or a television channel on daily news ever. But I really, my heart is with those people
yeah,
and with all the institutions that are actually trying to bring honesty to this reporting. And so that's important. And so really for me that's inspirational, watching this happening and people putting themselves at risk to do it.
yeah,
And then also the stories they're bringing of the people running the cremation grounds. Some of them are people, as you will know being Indian, but people may not realize that everything in India is governed by caste. So the people who do this essential work, how can society survive if we cannot deal with our dead, And so the people who do this most essential work are from some of the most oppressed castes and most deprived groups of people and despised groups of people. And yet they're doing this work that is saving all of us, from having other
absolutely,
epidemics and
yeah,
disease spreading and so on. And in some of those cremation grounds now, I'm hearing stories of women working. And I never thought we would see this in independent India.
yeah,
And we've not experienced this since partition. or the Bengal famine. We
Yeah.
have not this level of horror.
Yeah.
But there is inspiration everywhere as well by the work that ordinary people are doing, that many young people are doing. They don't have time to be self indulgent. They're learning, as it were, because of this crisis that's come before them. And they've had other crises to deal with in the past few years as well, young university students and so on, who are standing up for, secularism, for the Indian constitution and things. But now a lot of them are involved with this kind of relief work and so on. And this, in the end, is what will create a new India, out of the ashes of this
Yes.
horror. It's
Absolutely. I totally agree.
day by day. So my point about inspiration is that it's not necessarily the career you choose, but it's stepping up when there's a need to step up and doing,
Absolutely.
whether it's cooking a meal or being in a mutual aid group. I saw that in England as well. I mean, when I was in England, I was because I've been living in England most of my life, so that was my home. Is my home, and in fact, and my also have a home here with my mother in India. But I was part of a mutual aid group that was doing shopping and things. And at first, I was shielding at first, so I wasn't able to shop, but I was cooking regular meals for a homeless shelter where people didn't get COVID. They stayed healthy because they were really well looked after, and because we were able to, make sure that they got fresh hot
Very good.
food that the
So
government,
heartwarming.
So, but we were just one of thousands of other such efforts, that we saw people doing, because the British government also was massively failed in its duty to the people,
Yeah.
at the beginning and at various times when they didn't make the right decisions.
Yeah.
But people stepped forward to help each other and avert the worst catastrophes. I mean, I think people still did very badly. There were still many isolated people who had very little food left and so on. But at least some of the worst got mitigated by the work that everyone did.
Yeah,
So,
no, I totally agree with you. I think most of the governments world over, they failed spectacularly, to say the least. And it's the common people who have risen and done their bit. Otherwise,
yeah,
I don't know where we would be. Well, yeah, it is what it is now, and I'm sure there are many more inspirational stories and people working towards making it better for now in India and world over. So, coming back to where we were with your journey, so you were telling us about your growing up and then studying in Wales and the inspiration that came through your grandmother who dedicated herself to the service of humankind. So was it her influence that got you into what you did in life?
not directly. My grandmother's name was Vijayalaxmi Pandit.
Yes, of
Uh,
course, we know her.
she was an extraordinary person, but many of your audience wouldn't know her.
Yes, absolutely. Everyone, please do search up.
Yeah, she was one of 15 women who was also in the Constituent Assembly,
Yeah,
who helped
yeah,
the Indian, and also involved with the UN Charter, although at that time she wasn't official, but arguing about it, and so on. And so Indian women played a very big role at the foundation of the modern human rights movement, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I have to say that when I was growing up, I did not pay any attention to this because, of course, if you're not a little bit of a rebel when you grow up, then you have to.
absolutely.
I grew up being told by my mother, particularly, that we as Indian women didn't, need to fight for our rights because we had been granted rights through the freedom struggle. And of course, it was true in one sense that there were laws change, family law change, and so on for Hindu women, not for Muslim women. There were reforms, and there was we had the constitution. It wasn't untrue what she was saying, but I was a feminist. As a young woman, and I was very lucky that I left England in the mid 70s. I finished my degree, and in 77 to be precise, which was the year that India had recovered its democracy, because there's a short period when India had actually suspended parliament and been democracy under Indira Gandhi, who had been an inspirational prime minister when
Yeah.
she helped to liberate Bangladesh, helped supported the Bangladesh, their own liberation movement, and put the Indian army behind it, and did a really great thing. And then didn't have a war with Pakistan. I mean, it unilaterally ended the war. Didn't carry on for years like the Iraq War. Something actually helped the Bangladeshis themselves to reestablish, a democracy there initially, and then return the soldiers as prisoners of war who'd been taken. The Pakistani soldiers returned them to Pakistan, and that was really a very great era.
Absolutely.
However,
And I would say, even in terms of symbolism of breaking the glass ceilings, she is a symbol and, one of the icons who was doing it in, say, 70s, you know. How
yeah,
many world leaders were women at that moment, and with her grit and determination?
with her written determination. And she was actually my aunt because Vijayalaxmi Pandit was Nehru's sister, and Indira Gandhi was Nehru's daughter. So she was my mother's first cousin. Close. But my mother, who is a writer, Gita Sahgal, she's a fiction writer. She began to write. She was one of the first political journalists in India. So she was a columnist. She was writing opinion pieces. But she saw India developing under Mrs. Gandhi in a very authoritarian direction. So she began to criticize Mrs. Gandhi. And in her novels, actually, she predicted this growing authoritarianism when a lot of the big foreign experts sitting in fancy universities were saying, oh, nothing's happening and so on. They didn't want to criticize the government. And so she predicted it, and she became a dissenting voice and actually joined the opposition. She was never a political figure like my grandmother, who'd been an MP and so on. So my mother had no interest in party politics, but because she saw that the country was at massive risk, so she joined an opposition movement, and wrote about it and talked about it. And then when things when democracy was suspended and lots of people were put in jail. She wasn't put in jail, but she was under watch for a long time. And she was trying to
Oh,
send out as much information as possible. So I went through university in this very dark period. I mean, I was safely in England. Other people that we knew were being arrested in India. But we were going on demonstrations and things like that. So even though Mrs. Gandhi had been this huge inspiration in 1971 with this, which was really a landmark event, of the Bangladeshi people freeing themselves, but with the support of and the backing of the Indian army, which behaved in largely an exemplary fashion. I mean, this is a great story people don't know.
yeah, most of our generation like absolutely have no idea about the, the detailings around it. We just have a, broad idea that, yeah, she's a symbol and all. We don't have those details around what happened.
And there were 10 million refugees in India at that time on the East Coast. And now, when we think of the anti refugee sentiment, Indians took them in. I mean, there was the UNHCR, there were official refugee camps, but there were many, many ordinary people. I've heard this from Bangladeshi friends who just opened their homes, poor people in the
Oh,
border areas who opened their homes and took people in and looked after them. And the government did help as well. And Mrs. Gandhi said that this is always be a time for poor country can always accommodate more, you
yeah.
know, and India did at that time, and Indians did, ordinary Indians did, and so that's also something to remember. It's not just about military victory and so on. It's about this massive people to people solidarity that took place, which was one of again a sort of inspirational
Yeah,
moment.
I know. It's so heartwarming.
Yeah, so that
I'm
was
getting goosebumps. I don't know why, but I'm getting a lot of goosebumps while you're telling all these stories. It's so exciting and, so liberating at the same time, to hear all this. I'm sure
but
my viewers will love it.
later I made a film about it, so it became part of very important watershed for me. But I grew up with some knowledge about that, at that time, because everybody was trying to raise money and trying to, bring attention or do whatever little thing we could do as teenagers. And um, so that was one set of things. But then, and this is how heroes turn into anti-heroes. So Mrs. Gandhi became a dictator, and so we grew up in opposition to her. So when I came to sort of political activism as a young student in Britain, so as an Indian student, very concerned about the emergency in Britain, but also about racism in Britain. So we were
Yeah.
marching against the National Front, and attending anti-racist rallies and dealing with those kind of issues, um, and also very aware of other things going on in all sorts of other corners of the world. South Africa was a big issue. Palestine,
Yes.
a big issue as it is
Still
now,
is.
and so on. And at that time, Northern Ireland, there was a troops out movement, which by now I might be a bit more critical of. But anyway, so I was marching for troops out against what we saw as British atrocities in Northern Ireland,
Yeah.
mostly against the Catholic people of Northern Ireland and so on. So there was a whole series of things we were involved with. And at university, I wasn't very involved with particularly feminist politics. But I went back to India in 77 after there was a democratic election, which threw Mrs. Gandhi out of power, brought a coalition in, which was a sad story because that government didn't last very long. But anyway, the people had spoken that support
Yes, absolutely.
this dictatorship anymore. And what happened was very interesting from the point of view of civil society. So I landed back in India at a time where I now realize was a watershed moment in Indian history for civil society groups. So the People's Union of Civil Liberties in India was set up. There was some umbrella body, but eventually they broke into two different groups: People's Union of Civil Liberties and People's Union of Democratic Rights. They're still going, those groups,
Okay.
the
Okay.
PUCL and the PUDR. So they were Indian